Greetings to Hype and History. We have another installment of our exciting class looking at the intellectual history and cultural history of yoga. Today is going to be a little bit longer of a lecture because I just want to get through the material, and I'm going to give you a bit of a reprieve probably on the next one. So bear with me. We're about to learn an awful lot, once again, about yoga and the Yoga Sutras. So specifically here, and I know you were burning to know this, we're going to be talking about yoga as it existed in India. So while I'll use images from all over the place in the PowerPoint, we're really right now, we are going back in time and talking about yoga only as it existed in India. And when we're talking about the Yoga Sutras, we're really talking about yoga as it was practiced in India around the year 400 to 500 CE. So without further ado, let's get into this. And let me get our PowerPoint going. All right, and here we go. Let's share screen and make it happen. Always takes me a little bit of a second, but here we go. So today we are going to be talking about the Yoga Sutras, and I'm going to be giving you some context of this. You can see here a printed Sanskrit manuscript. I'm not sure of the script it's in. It might be Sharada. I'm not positive. I don't read that particular script. And look, I've misspelled my own name. That's very exciting. But let's get going. All right, so what is yoga? And what are the Yoga Sutras? The text that you read for today is called the Yoga Sutras. Read the translation by Stoller Miller. And I also gave you Bryant's more literal and short translation. So in the term Yoga Sutras, we have two words, yoga and sutra. So what does the word yoga mean here? Well, yoga here is from the Sanskrit root yuj. Why do I keep talking about Sanskrit? Well, Sanskrit is a 5,000-year-old language at minimum, and the majority of our earliest texts in yoga were written, or on yoga, were written in Sanskrit. These days, you can find yoga texts written in pretty much every language, but you'll see that the majority of yoga practitioners will trace the source of their knowledge back to Sanskrit sources. And I would bet you dollars to donuts, even though I really like donuts, that you would find the majority of people would say that their yoga practices, or even just the yoga philosophy, goes back to the Yoga Sutras. So yoga comes from the Sanskrit yuj, the Sanskrit root yuj. So from yuj, you get yoga. This means to yoke, like to join, to hitch up, as in hitching up a horse to a chariot. Now, we can find in the most prominent Sanskrit dictionary, when you look up the word yuj, or when you look up the word yoga, in particular, where out of yuj comes yoga, you can read to make ready, to equip an army, to offer a prayer, to offer a sacrifice, to connect, to bring together, to confer something or bestow something, to be married, to be fit, to be right or correct. And finally, one of the latest words we see is yoga is to be absorbed in meditation. And in fact, I see the word yoga being used in all sorts of texts I translate for recipes, for magic rituals. Yoga can be about anything. It's one of the most multifaceted words in the Sanskrit language. So the most common practices that we see in contemporary yoga when you go to a yoga studio are asana, which means, and the word asana means a seat or a mat or a body position. And pranayama is breath control. So that's when people do specific types of breathing in one nostril and out another. Chambered breathing, where you breathe into the base of your stomach and manipulate it with your diaphragm, or filling up your lungs and holding your breath. These are all sorts of different breath techniques that people use in contemporary yoga. Now, if you ask a contemporary yoga person, what does yoga mean? They'll just, for the most part, they'll just say it means union, which it means that, yuj, to yoke. That's our Indo-European root, to join, to hitch. But yoga is so much more than just union. And then when you ask them union of what, they'll say mind and soul, or body and spirit, man and God. You know, they'll say all sorts of things. But like I said, the earliest form of yuja is to hitch, or to yoke, as in to yoke up a horse to a chariot or an ox to a cart. So what is this other word, sutra? Well, sutra is a noun from the Sanskrit root siv. Siv becomes sut. Now, what does this root mean? or it means to, the root means to string together, to join, or to sew. Note sieve and sew, that's another Indo-European root. Another really great Indo-European connection from sutra is the word suture. So what is a suture? It is when you stitch together something. I know I performed a wedding ceremony one time for two surgeons, and there was a point where it was an Indian wedding ceremony, so we tied these scarves together, and I was telling them that, you know, it's fitting that I'm tying together surgeons into to marry, and I was singing a couple of Sanskrit sutras at the time, these verses that are also called sutras, and I'm suturing these two suturers together. They liked it. They thought it was fun. So a sutra can actually means a thread. Now, in a Sanskrit manuscript, they're not like books we usually look at. Like if you see up top here on the right, you'll see that, or maybe it's on your left, I'm not sure. You'll see that there's a hole in one center of that manuscript. Well, a stack of manuscripts, or a book once upon a time, would be loose leaf papers on palm leaf or birch leaf, and there would be a hole going all the way through it, and then there would be a string that would go through that, and they would call that a sutra. But if somebody just mentions the word sutra in general, like you also have the Kama Sutra, the sutras on desires, we'll get into that later, a sutra just means a short sentence or an aphoristic rule. So if I'm looking at, say, the Yoga Sutras, I'll notice they're very short little sentences that don't make a lot of sense. And that's why the translation is difficult. And you can see the difference in the translation between Bryant and Stoller Miller, because Bryant tries to be as literal as possible, and Stoller Miller gives me more of the flavor of the text. So yoga means something like hitching. Sutra means an aphorism. So what are the Yoga Sutras, that text that we're looking at today? They are the aphorisms on hitching up, or the aphorisms on yoga. I don't know if they're the aphorisms on hooking up. I never thought of that before. That sounds kind of weird. So two of the most common sources that we read on yoga today are the Yoga Sutras and also a text called the Bhagavad Gita. These are early texts that are mostly concerned with the salvation of a human being through meditation or devotion. And we'll be talking about them more in detail. Let's see. Finally, I wanted to give a definition of yoga, and we'll go back to this. And I don't have a slide for this, I'm sorry. Yoga, according to Barbara Stoller Miller and Yoga Sutra 1.2, which states in Sanskrit, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of the turnings of the mind. So what is yoga? Yoga, and I got to think in Sanskrit on this, Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Nirodha means like a cessation. Vritti means this like a turning or rotating. It's the volve from revolve in an Indo-European root. And then yoga means that, and then chitta means like the mind. So what is yoga? This state of union, possibly. It is the cessation of the turnings of the mind. So notice here, there's nothing talking about breathing. There's nothing talking about health. There's nothing talking about body positions. Yoga is just the stopping of the turnings of the mind. Now, much of what we read about in yoga vocabulary comes from a doctrine of philosophical religious thought in India called Samkhya. Now, Samkhya means something like Samkhya, to speak it all together or to look at it at once. I like the word enumeration. Samkhya has died out. There are no practitioners of Samkhya these days. However, Indian pundits and Brahmins and whatnot think about Samkhya all the time. I know I had a professor named Jerry Larson who used to say, who's a professor of Samkhya, and he would say, I am the only living proponent and practitioner of Samkhya. He was also an Episcopalian priest, I believe. But he was an interesting guy. So what does Samkhya argue? Samkhya argues that if you understand the world clearly, you can find your way to liberation. But how does the soul get liberated? Well, first, we have to understand the world. Now, the world, according to Samkhya, is made up of three things, three qualities called gunas. Now, what are the gunas? And if you start thinking about this, you'll find yourself thinking about the gunas all the time. It's so weird, but you will. So The idea is if you look at anything in the world, it's made of different varying amounts of these three substances. There's sattva, which is the pure, the essential, thought, the barely manifest, flowing water, knowledge, pure light. Then you have rajas, that's movement, something that's exciting, something that's agitating, something that's compelling, something that's spicy when you're thinking about food. So this is no longer pure. It is moving. It is activity. And then tamas, the torpid, the slow, a rock, a potato. So I know this seems sort of heady, but we're going to read about it more, and we'll come back to Samkhya often. So here are my images for you to think about. So if you would look at the world and you would try to see what is pure, what is like knowledge and light, pure light. What is something that's rajas is often described in the Sanskrit sources as being something that has movement, something that is, a flowing stream is one. In the natural world, what is something that's tamas? Tamas would be a rock. Rocks don't do anything. However, something that's rajas and tamas and a little bit of sattvas would be a tree. Why? Because a tree doesn't move, yet it is living and it's growing, yet it also takes in light. So it's a balance of all those three, and it's probably more tamas than rajas. But if you look at a human being, we have thought, we have wisdom, we have arts in our head. We have our bodies that are constantly doing all this stuff. That's kind of tamas, but it's doing activity. So in a sense, you could think of the electricity in your brain as sattvas, the blood flowing through your veins as rajas, and your muscles and bones are tamas. Okay, I like to think of this according to food. And actually, in a lot of Indians' diets will be a special blend of foods that they consider to be sattva, rajas, and tamas. And there's a style of sort of Sanskrit language oriented life sciences called Ayurveda. You may have heard of it before. Ayurveda is the science of longevity of life. And in Ayurveda, they'll talk about balancing the foods you eat. So what is a very pure food in this system? A very pure food would be just pure vegetables. Just anything like a white rice, white rice maybe. But yeah, pure vegetables, ghee, which is clarified butter. I notice when I go places and they serve me sattva food, I eat way too much of it because it doesn't have any spices in it or onions or garlic. So I just eat too darn much of it every time. Then you have rajas. Rajas is spicy things. Your spices, the stuff I really like. Spices and onions and garlic, the things that are thought to stimulate you inside. And tamas, what is tamas? Tamas would be torpid food that does nothing. I don't know, Bud Light. Bud Light is a tamas food. It encourages you to lay around and do nothing and makes you lazy. All right. Okay, so when we're talking about Purusha and Prakriti, now I just talked about all of those gunas. Those gunas are what make up Prakriti. Prakriti means nature. Purusha means spirit. So think of it this way. We are, as human beings, are Purusha. Purusha is pure, luminous spirit, free of content, pure awareness. Purusha as spirit comes into a body, and the body is Prakriti. The body is nature. The body is the solid thing. What else is Prakriti? Everything around us that we interact with. So our body is a balance of the three gunas. Everything we see is a balance of the three gunas. So Purusha is the spiritual essence. Some might say a universal soul. Some might say the individual soul. The question is that soul, your Purusha, who you are, are there many of them? Or do we all realize that we're one thing? They argue about this in the text. Now, Prakriti is nature, stuff, the emanated. The interesting thing is we think of our thoughts as being like the actions of our souls, but thought in this system is actually physical. Your thoughts are physical things. Now, why am I talking about the physical and the spiritual? Because the Purusha believes it is Prakriti. In reality, Purusha has never been Prakriti. Purusha gets confused and convinced that it is Prakriti, but it never has been. So let's look at some images here. So one of the most common sort of notions of what is Purusha and Prakriti is they'll say that Prakriti is a man who is blind, and Purusha is a man who is non-abled, who cannot walk, but can see. And he rides atop the head of the man who has the physical body, who cannot see. So that's what we are. And the goal is to separate ourselves out from Prakriti and see the essence of Purusha. Now, you'll notice the picture on the right is Master Blaster from the 1980s classic Mad Max and Beyond Thunderdome. I can't help myself. So the thing is to see that this is like an absolute dualism. But however, there's a trick to it. Prakriti, as we will see, is like a dancer on the stage, is the metaphor they say. And once Purusha realizes that it's not the dancer on the stage, what happens? They actually use metaphor. They say the dancer leaves the stage. And that's so poetic. And I imagine, let's see, I'm Purusha. I'm watching Prakriti, right? On the stage. And I'm so involved. Like I'm so involved in watching a movie that I believe I'm in the movie. But then when I realize it's just me watching the movie and the movie runs out and the movie images aren't doing anything more, what's left? The movie's over. Do I continue to stare at the screen? Do I think I have died because the movie is no longer going on because there are no images? I don't know. That's the problem. Or do I realize I've just been the viewer all along? I had a professor who would teach whole classes on Indian philosophy just about that metaphor of we are the viewer watching the screen. What happens when the screen goes empty? Do you see the screen? Do you see yourself? We don't need to get into that too much here. All right, so we're going to go over Samkhya again, but I want you to get it in your head, and you're going to see it in your reading in a couple of spaces. All right, so in the Yoga Sutras by Patanjali, there's a description of 8 limbs of yoga. The Sanskrit word for this is ashtanga, 8 limbs, like limbs of your body. And in fact, we'll see types of contemporary yoga that call themselves Ashtanga yoga. But when you look at this supposedly 8-limbed form of yoga that we'll actually talk quite a bit about in the second part of the class, you'll see they really only do 2 of the limbs. Asana, which is body positions, and pranayama, very specific type of breathing techniques. And for the most part, it's just asana. I knew a yoga teacher who would say, oh, those guys, they say 8 limbs. They only do 1. They only do 1. Anyway, so there are many, there are 6-limb forms of yoga, 4 limbs, 8 limbs, 12 limbs. They're all over the place. But this 8 limbs of yoga is the most famous one. So what are the 8 limbs of yoga according to Patanjali? Well, Patanjali says in chapter, and he starts on chapter 2, verse 28 and 29, and that sort of bleeds over to the 3rd chapter. I think originally this book didn't have 4 chapters. I think it might have only had 3 sections, and they got chopped up funny over the years. That's beside the point. So there are these 8 limbs of yoga. What are the first 2? Well, the first one is yama, and the other is niyama. Don't get confused with Yama, the god of death in Hinduism. So yama means moral principles, abstentations. These are the don'ts. You do your don'ts, and your niyamas are your do. Your observances, your penances, your voluntary actions. Yama, niyama, and one of my professors would always say, these are the do's and don'ts. Now, when I looked, the translation from Bryant is pretty good. So yama says these are nonviolence, or blah. The yamas are, according to Edwin Bryant, in his translation, these are nonviolence, truthfulness, refraining from stealing, celibacy, and renunciation of unnecessary possessions. And if you look at that, those are actually really similar to vows that Jain lay people take. Jainism is another religion in India that involves absolute nonviolence, but has a very similar conception of the soul as Samkhya. Oh, why am I bringing up all that Samkhya? In fact, Samkhya is called by a lot of people in India. They'll talk about Yoga Samkhya as one school, and they say that yoga is the means to realize Samkhya. So the reason why I was talking about all that Purusha and Prakriti and the gunas is because it's thought to be the philosophy behind this early yoga. So the niyamas, the observances, are cleanliness, contentment, austerity, study of scripture, and devotion to God. That devotion to God is an interesting one, and we'll come back to that in detail. Right, so here's your image. There are do's, there are don'ts. It's a list of stuff you do, it's a list of stuff you don't. Now in this, when I'm going through the 8 limbs, I want you to do 2 things. Listen to me talk, and then I'm going to show you an image. Why am I doing this? The idea is, and I could make the slides better, but I have some different ideas, and I wanted to try it this way. The idea was to get the thoughts in your head and then give you an image to stick to. Why do I have these 2 hands here? The do's and the don'ts. Do's, don'ts. Yamas, niyamas. Yamas, niyamas. Do's and don'ts. Okay. Yeah. So even if you look here at this list of stuff, under one of the niyamas, you'll see Ishwara Pranidhana. Ishwara means God, loosely. We'll find in the Yoga Sutras that the only time they mention God, they call him Ishwara or Yogeshwara. There's no Krishna, there's no Shiva, there's just this general word for Ishwara, for a general God, and he's only ever really called the Lord of Yoga. So it's hard to say who you're supposed to be worshiping or devoted to. All right, here's some more limbs. These are the ones we see that contemporary folk do. So asana. Asana just means posture, position, or seat. The posture should be steady or comfortable. So the exact phrasing is, it says like asana dridha sukha. So make yourself firm and sweet or pleasant. So if you look at a lot of modern yoga poses, they don't look very stable or comfortable. I mean, think of, people bent up in ridiculous manners. And we'll get into more of why they got to getting to those ridiculous body positions you see later. Pranayama, breath control. Letting forth or restraining the breath or energy. Interesting, prana is kind of like ki in, or chi in Chinese religions. It's the life force and breath that goes through your entire body. And ayama means something like to exercise, to expand, to move, and to use that essential bodily life force. So yoga poses, like this guy sitting on a rock here. And then you'll see this yogi up here. What's he doing with his fingers? What's he doing with this? Is he doing it when he was doing that one, right? Well, I can't remember. I can't remember what he's doing here. I can't do that with my hands. So I'll go breathe, close one nostril, in with that one, out with that one. So the thumb and the ring finger usually are the ones that they use. And the thumb and the ring finger are used to manipulate that. So you're breathing in and out, also breathing throughout the body and holding it and holding your breath. More limbs. These are more mental. So you have pratyahara, which means withdrawing of the senses, removing your senses from the contact with external objects. Now here we have to talk about Samkhya again. So how does Purusha contact Prakriti? Well, Purusha, pure awareness, takes the mind, which is called buddhi, the mind, and the ahankara, which is the ego. The ego and the mind are in contact with Purusha. Purusha contacts the ego and the mind, and then the ego and the mind go out and contact the senses. Now, the senses, in our minds, something comes in. That's how I see. Something comes in. Noise vibrations comes in. Light comes into my eyes. That's how I see. So they would say that instead, a ray of light that are your senses, they call these rashmi, goes out and contacts the thing that's making the music and then brings it back. Or you look out and you contact that thing and then you bring it back. This becomes important later. So the idea is that these rays of senses go out, are altered by the thing because they touch it. It's called a sparsha. They touch it, they bring it back, and then the mind and the ego do something with it, and then the Purusha looks at it. But the Purusha never really contacts all of that. It thinks it does, but it's just got all that apparatus going on. So pratyahara is removing the mind from contact and the senses from contacting anything. And this is supposed to reveal the true nature of mind. This is also, pratyahara is used to describe control of the senses. So the note here is when the senses, the translation here is, when the senses do not come into contact with the respective sense objects. So pratyahara, keeping the mind from connecting, the senses from connecting with sense objects. Now, if you're going through and you're reading through Bryant or you're reading through Stoller Miller, you'll notice that, boom, suddenly the chapter ends and you're moving on to chapter 3. So chapter 3 picks up after Pratyahara and Dharana. Dharana is concentration. Concentration is fixing of the mind in one place. Now, I was trying to look at translating this a little bit better, and the phrase is Deshabandha Chittatsya Dharana. So dharana just means sort of like bearing, and then chittasya, so the bearing of the mind, desha bandhas, against bindings of a direction. I mean, concentration is fixing of the mind in one place. I guess this is as close as I can get. All right, so withdrawal, you're covering your eyes and keeping the senses out, and concentration, you're concentrating the mind. So if this was in a sequence, you'd be disconnecting from sense objects, and then you'd be concentrating the mind on like one point and making it firm, either on your breath, on your essential nature, on scripture that you're studying. So concentration is very much like we would think about concentrating on stuff, just like it's really important to turn off your phone when you're watching a lecture. Withdrawal and concentration. All right, the final limbs. So the final limbs are dhyana. Now, dhyana is an interesting word. So dhyan, and here's your little side note, dhyan, when Buddhist monks were practicing dhyana or dhyan, went to China, they began teaching the practice of the Chinese, who called it chan from dhyan. And then when the Chinese brought Buddhism to Japan, it became Zen. Dhyan, chan, Zen. There you go. Well, impress your friends. Fun at parks. So dhyana, or meditation here, is one point that it actually says, when I was translating, it says meditation is the one pointedness of the mind on one image. Stoller Miller says meditation is focusing on a single conceptual flow. That's a bit much. Tatra pratyayika tanata dhyana. I can't get a great translation, but the point is that the mind is focused on a single, it's focused and it's one pointed. Not like you're just concentrating the mind, because concentration of the mind, there's still movement around. You're just focused and absorbed in meditation. And then finally, we have samadhi. Samadhi means, it means union. It also means result. It also means putting all these things together. Some people translate it as enlightenment. So Edwin Bryant translates this: samadhi is when that same dhyana that we talked about before shines forth as the object alone, and the mind is devoid of its own reflective nature. That's very smart. Stoller Miller says, pure contemplation is meditation that illumines the object alone, as if the subject were devoid of intrinsic form. I don't know what that means. I wrote that jhana exists illuminating only itself and exists in its true form, empty. So that's my even more literal translation of this verse. The verse says, Tadevarte matra nirbashanam swarupa shunyam eva samadhihi. As I look at that, I once again stood by my translation. So what is samadhi? But it's a realization, I would say, of Purusha, or of the soul, essentially understanding itself only to exist and dwelling in only that self-luminous state. So if we're back to Samkhya, samadhi would be where Purusha only knows itself. So I flipped these around a little bit. Notice meditation is seating in that meditative spot, and samadhi is resting in almost like meditative completion and union with the soul and everything. All right, so commonly you'll see these 8 limbs sort of put in little sequences. Here it's around a wheel, and wheels are dharma. They're chakra, varta, dharma, varta, the wheels of dharma. I remember you have yamas and niyamas here described as external and internal disciplines, which I don't quite buy. Asana, posture, pranayama, breath control, pratyahara, withdrawal of senses, concentration, dharana, dhyana, meditation, and ultimately union or integration. The question is, are these a sequence? Are they different steps? Do they go in order? It's hard to say. Different texts say different things. All right, take a break. Pause the video, hit pause. You can do a yoga break with this gal. Get yourself into a yoga pose. Get yourself a soda pop, new cup of coffee, cup of tea, whatever you need. I'm going to pause here for a second, and then I'll be right back to complete this lecture. You got me. I didn't actually pause my video. I'm on a roll, so I'm just going to continue. But you had a chance to pause and take a little break, take a bio break, whatever you need. All right, caffeination. Okay, so there's a little bit of a horse in the room when we talk about yoga. I've talked about how there are contemporary people that talk about Ashtanga yoga, the eight-limbed yoga. Well, a lot of other people will also talk about what we call modern postural yoga as being Hatha Yoga. Now, Hatha Yoga has some very specific meanings that I'm about to get into. Now, I've heard everything from Hat means gentle. Hatha is the gentle yoga, or the yoga of the hand that guides you. This is a misreading of the Hindi term hat, which means hand, which is derived from the Sanskrit hasta, not hat, the root. But this Sanskrit root, hat, means a violent strike. So Hatha Yoga is actually a violent form of yoga. What? Yogic violence? What would I possibly be talking about? Well, it's complicated, as per usual. What I like to think about is that Hatha Yoga starts coming up, I'd say, like most of the yoga that we've described so far in the Ashtanga Yoga is going to be mostly meditative. There will be body positions, but you're never going to hold that, but you're never going to like do like 15 body positions. I mean, Patanjali just says, pick one body position, get firm, get comfortable, get there, don't move, be cool. Is kind of what Patanjali says. Now, Hatha Yoga gets a little different because in Hatha Yoga, you are manipulating the body. So Hatha Yoga was originally types of exertions that would force energy through the body. Sometimes they would have things like standing up all the time to manipulate energy, or standing on your head so that you would reverse the flow of digestion. And instead of everything moving downward as we eat and everything moves down, instead you could take that energy and move it upward. What we're really getting at here is it's a somaticized yoga, which is how people are describing it in the most recent years. Somaticized, so bodily focused. So instead of yoga being as focused on the mind per se, yoga becomes a way of manipulating the body. Now, if you talk to contemporary Hatha yogis in India, they'll say that they manipulate the body in order to cause mental and spiritual changes. But the most important thing to remember with this turn to Hatha Yoga, which happens around 1200 and goes on, I mean, arguably until contemporary times. I mean, maybe even 1400. It's hard to say. The texts are kind of funky. So this is the point where people yogis start manipulating their bodies using physical techniques. What are these physical techniques? Oh my goodness, you're going to get tired of hearing about this. Look to your right. You'll see this yogi here. And this yogi will be male. In what I call the hydraulic system, you will perform meditation that forces your essential life energy, which is almost always semen, up the spine through bodily manipulation and meditation and whatnot you're doing. So you're pushing semen or subtle fluid, it's semen, up. It's even called a bindu or a bindi, which means like a drop of semen. It's pushed up the spine and then it goes into the brain, and it's thought that in the brain it transmutes and then will rain back down on the inside of your head as a nectar that will give you eternal life. I will talk about this a lot. What about the ladies? Well, I mean, there's an argument that semen and uterine blood are considered analogous in sort of Indian medicine, and that possibly female yogis could be forcing their essential uterine blood instead of it being expelled, arguing that menstruation is the same as ejaculation, which is a big argument, that uterine blood can be manipulated and pushed up through the body, and that would be a female analogous thing of creating this divine hydraulic nectar that comes to the head. Anyway, this is going to come up a lot, so get used to it. The intriguing thing we found out in the last few years is that the earliest Hatha Yoga texts that use the term Hatha and talk about this type of procedure were Buddhist, in fact. I mean, Hatha Yoga is considered like almost always it's considered Hindu, but we found the earliest practitioners were likely Buddhist. So that's a little fun thing. All right, so there's a kind of problem here. There's a difference between yoga and yogis. So think of it this way, and Professor White talks about that a little bit in his intro that you read today to his book, Yoga and Practice. So yoga is generally considered a bodily or a mental practice that is thought to cause spiritual religious evolution. Now, a yoga practice is different from a yogi practice. A yogi is one who does yoga. And when I talk, I mean, you'll hear people call themselves yogis and yoginis, and I'll tell you in a minute why that's sort of goofy when Westerners say it. A yogi, or often said as a jogi in India and South Asia, they are people who have renounced the world. They travel, they perform yoga, they are thought to be spiritually advanced. They're also considered to be kind of tough guys and often kind of vampiric. So they're actually not good guys. A yogi is considered an itinerant one. He could also be a spiritual practitioner, a sadhaka. He might be a beggar, a renunciate soldier. A yogi could be anyone who's just doing anything. A jogi is a yogi in a more decisive term. So if somebody calls somebody a jogi, they're saying a bad thing. And a term yogini is a female yogi, and I'll talk to you in a minute about why yogini is not a very nice term. So yogis are rough and tumble guys. I mean, when I spend time with them, they're tricky. They're often not very educated. In the North, they all speak Hindi, so that's easy for me. But they're tricky to get access to. And when you do talk to them, they describe yoga very differently than we describe yoga when we talk about modern postural yoga. We're going to do a whole unit on that because we have some very good ethnographic research from a contemporary scholar that I'm going to present to you. All right, what's a yogini? All right, so I always laugh when I'm talking to somebody at a party and a woman says, I'm a yogini. I go, I don't know if you want to say that. Well, yoginis are ostensibly female yogis. But in reality, the term refers to in the medieval and early era, and even when you talk to people today in India, yoginis were considered witches. They were thought to swoop through the air, and if you could appease them, they would give you magic powers. You could also have sex with them, if you're a male yogi, of course, and that would give you magical powers and maybe even give you enlightenment. And if you do all that wrong, they eat you and kill you. So yogini is also a term that's used for tantra consorts. What's tantra? Tantra is referred to in the contemporary world as being the seeking after therapeutic orgasms. Here, tantra is a set of rituals designed to grant magical powers and spiritual evolution through very rigorous, intense rites. Now, on the left and in the middle, you'll see that these yoginis were animal-headed. They were often depicted as flying animal-headed witches. And on the right, there's not a great picture, but that's a place I've been a bunch of times that has, I believe that's 64 yoginis all around. They all have like cobra heads and like badger heads, like all like intense, like bull heads. And they're kind of scary. But, you know, if you worship them properly, like with so much in Hinduism, that which is scary when properly worshipped is a good thing. So be aware of that distinction between yoga philosophy and yogi practices. So here's one yogi I know on the left. They call him Kari Baba because he's always standing. And those dreadlocks, as you can see, they are significantly longer than they look. They trail behind him. And I've always noticed I'll knock on his door and he always opens it up, but there's a bed behind him. And people say, Kari Baba, he's always standing. I'm like, well, yeah, unless the door is closed. So yet these are yogis, you know, not your guy in a mall or in a strip mall. And yoginis, again, here's some more of my pictures. There's a cobra-headed one on the left. So they're kind of scary. They're demonic witches that if you worship them right, you might be okay. If you're not their darling, you're going to be their dinner. Look out. We'll get more into this when we get into Tantra. All right, so now I'm going to transition to the last part of the lecture, and we're going to be talking about David White's piece that you wrote about his introduction to yoga, and then you're going to probably do an activity I have set up that is around that for the rest of the class today. So White writes, and he's written this quote several times, and he's even expanded it, but he says, yoga, the word yoga, has a wider range of meaning than nearly any other word in the entire Sanskrit lexicon. The act of yoking an animal, as well as the yoke itself, is called yoga. And of course, there's always the term that the kids say today, you see a muscular guy, say, that guy's yoked. I'm always confused by that. In astronomy, a conjunction of planets or stars, as well as a constellation, is called a yoga. When one mixes together various substances, that too can be called yoga. The word yoga has been employed to denote a device, a recipe, an endeavor, combination, union, an arrangement, zeal, care, diligence, industriousness, discipline, use, application, contact, a sum total, and the work of alchemists. But this is by no means an exhaustive list. And if you go to many dictionaries, Sanskrit dictionaries, and you look at the word yoga, it is impressive. It is one of the longest entries that I see around, other than for the Sanskrit root kri, to do or make. That's usually the longest. But yoga's right after that. So White talks about yoga in some early scriptures, and I don't really know if I want to go into it because I think it's a little bit too much. What I would like to do is I'd like to go to the end of the chapter when White posits 4 different principles or descriptions of yoga. So what are these 4 descriptions of yoga? First, he says yoga can be an action, or yoga as an analysis of perception and cognition. This is very true. And like the mental, you'll notice that all of these are very mental until we get to the last one. Yoga as the raising and expansion of consciousness. Yoga as a path to omniscience. And finally, yoga as a technique for entering other bodies, generating multiple bodies, and attainment of other supernatural accomplishments. So yoga is a way to understand your perceptions and your mind, 1. Yoga as raising of energy and expanding consciousness, 2. Yoga is a path of omniscience, of all knowing and of extrasensory perception. And 3, a technique for magic powers and stealing people's bodies. What don't you see? Health, well-being, flexibility. I mean, that's just not in there. On the other hand, remember, we're talking about ancient India. So exercise as a term isn't there. Their notion of well-being, swadha, means like being well placed within yourself. That doesn't exactly translate to being healthy. When they talk about being in a healthy state of swadha, they would say that your 3 gunas, rajas, tamas, sattvas, and the various like elements in your body are balanced. That's not there either. You don't see union with God or union with, I mean, maybe with union of higher self and lower self as raising an expansion of consciousness. But in these 4 principles of yoga, we see a really good description of what texts until the modern era describe as yoga. So let's go through these a little bit, and then we'll be finished for the day. So yoga as an analysis of perception and cognition. Now, the thing is, as White writes, the way we see the world is erroneous. It's false. And we see this in so many of the South Asian religions. When we know that how we see is false, we can see this problem of our false knowledge, and using meditation and philosophical inquiry, we can find freedom. This argument is found in almost all the Indian traditions. I mean, with Buddhism, it's realizing that you have no soul and you're suffering. And if you cling to suffering, you will be in pain, and you'll only be in pain. Hinduism could argue that you mistakenly believe in this illusion around you, when eternally you are actually the divine experiencing the divine out there, but there's only illusion. Jainism argues that your understanding of yourself is occluded by karmas that are like sticky goo that stick all over your body and all over your brain, so you can't see the world as it is. All of these state that we see the world wrong, and if we know the truth and completely absorb and know the truth like in us completely, then we will be freed. In this sense, I got religious studies terms for you. All right, so the first term I want to give you is soteriology. Sorry, I don't have this on the slide. So soteriology is a doctrine of salvation. And we find this, so what is soteriology in Christianity? You are saved by accepting Christ into your heart, or by the miracle of communion, or whatever, depending on the version you're involved with. So the soteriology here is that we are stuck in a material world and suffering. We need to get out. The only way out is called moksha, the unlocking, the release. Or you may know this term, nirvana, from Buddhism, which means the blowing out or the extinguishing. So religious studies tells us that this is called a gnoseology. Soteriology, study of how you get saved. Gnoseology is you are saved by gnosis. What is the word gnosis? It comes from the Indo-European root gno or gnoho. Sanskrit has the word gnana or gna, which also means Indo-European, to have knowledge, to learn, to know. So Gnostic, knowledge. Those words are connected. So how do you become saved? You have proper knowledge of the world. Gnosis is transcendent, immediate, non-conventional knowledge of reality. It's a pure vision of what the world really is. And once you experience gnosis, you have a change in your knowledge and your way of perceiving reality. There's a concept in Christianity called metanoia, which is the changing of the man. So gnoseology, this is also part of epistemology, how people know things. So if you know the world through the Gnostic experience of gnosis, then you can find salvation. Thus, Indian salvation is a gnoseology. So it's a theory of soteriology based on gnosis, in that salvation comes through knowing the truth, and knowing the truth is realizing the truth, and the direct acquisition of and realization of the truth leads to liberation. So White writes, in all of these systems, the necessary condition for gnosis is the disengagement of one's cognitive apparatus from sense impressions and base matter, including the matter of the body. What does this mean? How do you get gnosis? Withdrawing the senses from their sense objects to realize one's true luminous nature. That is the goal of this gnosis. So we have a notion, and I talked about this a little bit, that you have manas or chitta. So that means pure awareness. Manas, you get mind. Now, manas or chitta or awareness becomes in contact with buddhi, which is insights, vijnana, thinking, and ahamkara, which is an antahakara, which means the ego. Your higher these are your higher consciousness, your discerning mind, and your ability to have thoughts. So your conscious awareness is what you actually are, but that's even slowed down. Then it comes in contact with the mind. Then the mind goes out and contacts sense objects. When you're doing yoga, you're unhitching. In fact, so yoga is sort of a yoga. You're unhitching the sense impressions from the mind. So the goal is to reject the outside world and to find the truth sort of within yourself. And notice here that yoga, in this sense, sort of connotes disunion. So what is yoga? Is it the hitching or the unhitching, the union or the disunion? Perhaps, and I think the earliest version of yoga was really about not joining with the world. It's about separating from it. Okay, so here's the thing. We have a term in English called the Gnostic mysteries. These go back to, you can find them in ancient wisdom, the Dharmic faiths in this image, so the faiths of India, the Gospel of Philip. So we have a notion in Christianity that there were these characters called Gnostics, and they were able to realize the truth, which was usually that God is actually evil. And in fact, there's a greater God, and that greater God kind of lost control of things and let this crappy God make this world where we're all suffering. And if we can see beyond the world to the greater, purer God, then we will be free of suffering and we can unite with him. So when people will talk all throughout sort of the Western canon about the mysteries, and often what they mean is this secret knowledge that is the realization of the truth of who you are. Okay. Okay, here's that quote I said before. In all these systems, the necessary condition for gnosis is the disengagement of one's cognitive apparatus from sense impressions and base matter. Okay, so the second one, yoga is expansion. White writes, yoga as the raising and expansion of consciousness. Here, the lower parts of the self, i.e. the mind and the senses, are raised using meditation and reasoning. So you take the science and you take the senses and whatnot, and you don't disunite from them, but you channel them into something and push them likely upward and outward into a greater wisdom and experience of the world. This is connected to breath. Yoga as expansion, just like our breath expands. In fact, the word Atman, which is the word for the soul in one system of philosophy, comes from the root un, which means to breathe. Our breath is connected to our souls. Our breath is connected to our consciousness. When you can breathe and your breath encompasses the entirety of existence, you're having yogic expansion, and you're going to have brilliant vision, and you're going to learn all sorts of stuff. The interesting thing to me about this is that in almost all the systems I can think of, there's an attention to breath. So you have pranayama, in which you're breathing in a specific way or meditating on the breath. I know the first time I learned Buddhist meditation techniques from a Theravada teacher, he just said it's all about your nose. And you pay attention to the way your nose, when you breathe out and you breathe in, and you focus on where the in breath and the out breath meet. And he said, that's the system that got the Buddha enlightened. That one will get you enlightened. He says it's simple and you can spend your whole life working on it. All right, so yoga as expansion of consciousness, taking the senses and the breath and expanding them upward and outward to encompass all things. Again, we're looking at not what you see in a yoga studio, what you find in these early yoga texts. Yoga is an enlightenment. Look at how the breath, the expansion, expanding the senses, expanding the self to encompass everything. So the third one, yoga as all-knowing. And the word here in Sanskrit is sarvagnya, and that means literally to know all things. Gna, gnosis. Sarva means all things, so a gnosis of all. In Christianity, we talk about God being omnipotent, omniscient, and all-loving. So all-loving, he is absolute love. Omniscient, knowing all things, and omnipotent, can do anything. That's about enough on Christianity for the moment. There's always a chance to head back to it. All right, so yoga as a technique for yoga as, hold on, let me make sure. Okay, so I have yoga as a technique for omniscience, yoga as a path for omniscience. So we had raising and expanding consciousness, and here's another question. Could it be that you withdraw, then you expand, and then you experience all-knowing? Maybe these work as sequence. Maybe not. Maybe they're 4 different things. Maybe they're sequences on the same road of development. So yoga moves from what we saw before of raising and expanding consciousness to experiencing everything and everywhere in the world. In all-knowing, the yogi is able to know things far away. This might be through yogi pratyaksha, which is something means like pratyaksha means aksha means the eye, prati what comes before. So what happens in front of the eye is normal pratyaksha manusya of normal people. Yogi pratyaksha is yogi perception, where a yogi can know all things. In the Mahabharata, the classic epic, we read about yogi pratyaksha as durdrishtayam, which is the ability to see at a distance. And we have one character who can see at a long distance without being there, and another character who's blind, and he dictates the action to this other character. The whole idea is you can learn to see all things far away. Also, we see that in the paths of enlightenment, right when people become enlightened, such as the Buddha, he gains knowledge of all things. In Jainism, when Mahavir becomes enlightened, he becomes sarvagnya as well. He knows all things and all lives, passwords and forward. We have figures in Hinduism, such as rishis, the seers who see the entirety of the universe and reveal wisdom, or siddhas, perfected ones who are all-knowing. The Buddha was said to have a Buddha eye, that he could go out and know the past and the future, know anything that was going on. So yoga as a path of all-knowing. Fine. So here we have all-seeing and omniscience. So look at these all-seeing eyes right here. I think the guy on the right kind of looks like he's all-knowing. Okay, and finally, yoga as a technique for entering other bodies, generating multiple bodies, and the attainment of other supernatural accomplishments. This is probably the most shocking to everybody. So, like I said, everyday perception is called pratyaksha, or what happens before the eyes. Now, you remember when I talked about Samkhya and perception? Here, the ray of one's senses goes out, sort of your eye, your ear, your nose, and it makes contact, makes sparsha with something else, and then it comes back and it tells you what it discerned because it changes. The ray returns carrying back the experience of that contact. So, how could this relate to magic powers? Well, in the Mahabharata, we see yogis who enter other people's bodies via rays emanating from their eyes that go into the bodies of others. So, this is if your full consciousness could be harnessed to the Rashmi, the sensory thing that goes out and sees another person, what if it could see their eyes and go inside and in there change that person's mind, control that person's mind? When we read stories about yogis, the earliest ones, and lots of them out there, we'll read about this a little later, they're constantly taking over people's bodies, either to go live a longer life because they're dying, or to control a king, like to take over a king's body so they can help their yogi order or whatnot, or get whatever they want. I mean, there's all sorts of stories about yogis traveling out of their bodies and being in multiple bodies at once. There's even stories about finding a yogi who's in other bodies at the time, and what do you do with the body of a yogi who's in other bodies? So there's a lot that goes on. A yogi is said to be able to walk the earth and while occupying many different bodies at once. So there's this notion of yogis taking over bodies. Sometimes we'll have a discussion of a yogi manifesting many bodies, like contemporary, like sort of saintly stories about yogis will be like, oh, he manifested in different places. No, I'm talking about a yogi being able to control all sorts of different bodies. We're going to see this in different texts moving forward. It's interesting because in some of these stories, they will remove the other person from their own body, and in other ones they don't. It's just like the other person's there, but the yogi's just in control. All right, so in this we have a sense of like yogis that are like vampires. Look at this yogi taking over somebody's body, and look at their crazy eyes on the cover of this book. Sinister Yogis is a book that David White wrote about yogis and how they're up to no good, and we're going to read a chapter in that. But remember here, yogis can generate multiple bodies. They can take over other bodies. And other 2 points that are grasped in here are they gain supernatural powers or siddhis. We'll see this in chapter 3 of the Yoga Sutras. Also, yogis may generate a perfected body. There's a classic story about one yogi meets another yogi, and he says, I am so strong. You can take this sword and strike me with it. And the yogi strikes the guy with it, and the sword breaks. And the guy says, I am even stronger. And the other yogi grabs the sword, and he swipes it at him, and it just goes right through his body without hurting him. Yogis and perfected bodies. Okay, stay time. You're all done. You earned it. Thanks for sticking in there. We'll try to make it a little bit quicker on the next one. You'll have a couple of activities. It's been my pleasure being with you today, and I will catch you on the flip side. Take care, y'all.